So in this case, we have the competing moral principles. I've already explained what the way in which these competing moral principles can actually be pressed against each other. So the question is, how do we use these principles to figure out what to do? Now, this is where the challenges to principlism or the principles approach really come about. A lot of people are unsatisfied with the way that Beecham and Childress have historically thought that we can use these principles in applying them in our cases. So one challenge that people often talk about is that because you have this plurality of 4 principles, and because you basically don't, Beecham and Childress don't want to have any sort of priority structure between the principles, it lacks some systematicity. There's just not going to be a way to systemically get all the cases right. Now, Beecham and Childress, in some ways, are going to concede this point, but they just don't think that that's that necessary. Systematicity is something that philosophers really care about, or people that care about the high theory. But if you actually care about the cases, and you care about getting those cases right, Beecham and Childress really do stress the moral complexity of the situations we face. Okay, so that's sort of their response to the lack of systematicity. Second, there really is this worry that it fails to guide action. So the principles are important, they are important to think about, but they don't yield a determinate answer to a given hard case. And that's the Clausert and Gert. So that's the challenge that Clausert and Gert bring up that you are expected to read for this week. Now, there's different ways to cash out this fails to be action guiding. So one, the principles are like chapter headings. They're too abstract and they themselves need further interpretation. This came out a little bit in the discussion with Charlie Gard. So what do we mean by beneficence? Do we mean, or what do we mean by the child's best interest? Is the child's best interest, if you can have different views of what the child's best interest could be. So one way is to sort of have a hedonistic approach to what is in the child's best interest. So it's in the child's best interest to only have good experiences or have the most amount of good experiences possible, the least amount of painful experiences. That's sort of a hedonistic view. But then there's a vitalist view, which holds that extending one's life is in one's best interest. If you have that view, then your conception of what beneficence requires in the Charlie Gard case is going to be very different than if you have the hedonistic view. And finally, there's this, there might be this sort of idea that that it comes up in the discussion with Charlie Gard that you have an interest in not in dying with dignity, right? So how that actually relates to one's experiences or one's pleasures and pains, how that actually relates to one's capacity to extend their life, these are really difficult questions. So the principles, just knowing that the principle of beneficence is really important and prima facie binding isn't actually going to be able to tell us in this given case how it's binding. So that's the first worry. The second worry is this idea that when the principles conflict, there's no underlying rule for resolution. And Clausert and Gert believe that the only way to have some sort of resolution is to move up and to go into the higher theory, right? So that's sort of the second worry. And the third way to cash this out is that it fails to be action guiding because it's not only the principles that are undeterminate, it's the facts on the ground as well. The facts don't come neatly labeled. So in the case in the Charlie Gard case, what it means to die with dignity or what medical futility entails are really contentious topics that aren't really going to be, those need to be resolved in order for us to even think about how the principles of beneficence, autonomy, non-maleficence, and justice apply. Okay, so those are sorts of ways in which the principles approach may not yield a determinate answer. So can principlism be action guiding? There's two ways to deal with these conflicting principles. And I've already sort of alluded to one, but I think that it's important to highlight exactly what the two different ones are. Okay, so the first one is weighing and balancing. In certain cases or in certain domains, one principle will outweigh the others. So, for example, when physicians and parents disagree about a medical intervention, the good of the child is more important than respect for the decision-making authority or autonomy of the parents. So that's sort of an example of how autonomy in this case is outweighed by beneficence. Another way of thinking about it, though, is specification. So this is Henry Richardson and David DeGrazia have defended this claim or this way of thinking about it. And in some ways, as Beecham and Childress develop their view, it becomes more and more a view about specification and less a view about weighing and balancing. So the idea here is rather than saying that in certain cases or domains one principle will outweigh the others, what specification is, as we look at the cases, they allow us to specify the abstract principles into further detail and sort of more nuance. So an example of basically the same sort of action guiding prescription in the Charlie Gard case, but one of specification would be parents have decision-making authority or autonomy only to the extent that they are making decisions with their child's best interest in mind. If they're not making decisions with their child's best interest in mind, then they lose that sort of authority. So here, it's not that beneficence outweighs autonomy, but thinking about what is in the interest of the child puts a limit on or shows where the limit of respect for autonomy is. So when it comes to specification, it's not about one principle outweighing or no longer being binding, but it's about sort of what the internal constraints are for the given principle. All right, so that's sort of an overview of the principlist approach. And I have 3 questions that I think are really important for you to think about as you read. So first is, so you're going to be reading 2 different exemplars. You're going to be reading Dworkin and you're going to be reading Sevalescu and company. So the question that I have is, how did these 2 exemplars get from principles to guiding our action in a specific case? I think they actually do, each of the articles do it very differently. So that's something to keep in mind. The second question is, do the principles conflict in these cases? If so, do the authors weigh the different principles against each other? And do they further specify the principles to alleviate any worries about the conflict? So basically, when the principles conflict, if they do, is there a weighing and balancing, or is there a specifying? Do they employ some other strategy? And then finally, one question that really hasn't come up, but I think is a really interesting one is, are there certain ethical values that are not fully encapsulated by the 4 principles? So do the authors bring up something that really just doesn't make sense to think about when it comes to justice, beneficence, non-maleficence, or autonomy? Basically, the third question is, does the principlist approach leave something really important out? Okay, so these are the questions to think about as you read. Thank you for listening, and I am looking forward to hearing your discussion posts for the week.